The scream of wind cut through Josephine Parker's consciousness like a blade, dragging her from the fevered delirium that had consumed her for the past 2 hours. Ice pelted her face with such fury that each strike felt like a tiny hammer against her skin, and she stumbled forward through the barren Nevada landscape, her worn boots slipping on stones that were rapidly becoming slick with frozen rain. She had left Belmont 3 hours ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate need to escape the man who had claimed ownership of her life. And now, the April sky had turned murderous, transforming what should have been spring weather into a frozen assault that threatened to steal her last breath. Blood trickled from a cut above her eyebrow, where a particularly large piece of hail had struck her, mixing with the rain and ice that plastered her dark hair to her skull. Her dress, a simple cotton thing meant for warmer days, clung to her body like a second skin, offering no protection against the elements. Josephine could barely see 10 feet ahead through the curtain of ice and rain, but she forced herself to keep moving because stopping meant death. She had learned that lesson well during her 22 years of life. Most recently during the 6 months she had spent as the unwilling companion of Marcus Hendricks, a saloon owner in Belmont, who believed that buying a woman's debts gave him the right to own her completely. The hailstorm intensified, and Josephine wrapped her arms around herself, trying to preserve what little warmth remained in her core. Her teeth chattered so violently that she bit her tongue, tasting copper. She had been heading east, trying to reach the small mining camp she had heard about from one of the other girls at the saloon, a place where she might find work that did not require selling pieces of her soul. But the storm had disoriented her, and now she had no idea if she was still moving in the right direction or simply wandering in circles until the cold claimed her. Through the gray veil of the hailstorm, a darker shape emerged. At first, Josephine thought it might be a rock formation or perhaps a large tree, but as she staggered closer, her heart leaping with desperate hope, she realized it was a structure. A cabin, small and sturdy, sitting alone in the Nevada wilderness like a miracle made of wood and stone. Smoke rose from the chimney, the gray wisps barely visible against the storm-dark sky, and a warm yellow glow emanated from a single window. Josephine tried to run, but her legs had gone numb, and she managed only a lurching walk that sent her sprawling twice before she reached the wooden door. Her hands, blue-tinged and shaking, could barely form a fist to knock, but she managed 3 weak thumps against the solid wood before her knees buckled and she collapsed against the door frame, sliding down until she sat in a heap on the small covered porch. Hail bounced around her, some pieces as large as hen eggs, and she tucked her head down, protecting it as best she could while she waited to see if anyone had heard her knock. Inside the cabin, Zachary Ashford had been cleaning his rifle when he heard the sound. At first, he thought it might be a branch blown against the door by the violent wind, but then he heard it again, weaker this time, and something in his gut told him this was not the storm playing tricks. He set the rifle aside and crossed the single room in 4 long strides, his hand already reaching for the iron latch. The door swung inward, and Zachary found himself staring down at a woman who looked like she had been dragged through hell backwards. She was soaked to the bone, shivering so hard that her whole body seemed to vibrate, and blood streaked her deathly pale face. Her eyes, a startling green even in her current state, looked up at him with a mixture of hope and terror that hit him square in the chest. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible over the roar of the storm. Zachary did not hesitate. He bent down and scooped her up in his arms, shocked by how light she felt, how cold her skin was even through the soaked fabric of her dress. He kicked the door shut behind him, cutting off the howling wind and the assault of ice, and carried her directly to the stone fireplace where a healthy fire burned. "I have got you," he said, his voice low and steady. "You are safe now." Josephine wanted to respond, wanted to thank this stranger who had appeared like an answered prayer, but her teeth were chattering too hard to form words. She was dimly aware of being lowered onto something soft, of rough but gentle hands working at the buttons of her dress, and she should have been frightened or ashamed, but all she felt was a desperate gratitude for the warmth that was beginning to seep into her frozen limbs. Zachary worked quickly, his movements efficient and respectful, despite the intimate nature of the task. He had seen exposure before, had lost 2 friends to the cold during a winter cattle drive 5 years ago, and he knew that getting her out of the wet clothes was a matter of life and death. He averted his eyes as much as possible while he stripped away the sodden dress and undergarments, then immediately wrapped her in thick wool blankets from his bed. Her skin was like ice, her lips blue, and her shivering had become more violent now that she was near the heat. "Can you hear me?" Zachary asked, settling her on a chair he had pulled close to the fire. He knelt in front of her, his hands rubbing her arms through the blankets, trying to encourage circulation. "I need you to stay awake. Talk to me if you can." "CC cold," Josephine managed, her jaw aching from the force of her shivers. "I know, the warmth will come back soon. What is your name, Josephine Parker?" "Josephine." Zachary nodded, committing it to memory. "I am Zachary Ashford. You are in my cabin about 5 miles east of Belmont. You are safe here." The mention of Belmont sent a jolt of fear through Josephine that momentarily overpowered even the cold. Her green eyes widened, and she tried to sit up straighter. "He will look for me. Marcus will look for me." Zachary's expression darkened at the raw fear in her voice. He did not need to ask who Marcus was or what he had done to put that terror in her eyes. He had seen enough in his 30 years to recognize a woman fleeing an abusive situation. "No one is taking you anywhere you do not want to go," he said firmly. "Not from my home." Something in his tone, the absolute certainty of his words, made Josephine believe him. She sagged back against the chair, exhaustion crashing over her now that the immediate crisis had passed. Her shivering began to ease slightly as the heat from the fire penetrated the layers of wool surrounding her, and she found herself studying the man who had saved her life. Zachary Ashford was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of a man who made his living through physical labor. His hair was dark brown, slightly too long, curling at his collar, and his face was all strong angles and weathered skin that spoke of years spent under the harsh Nevada sun. But it was his eyes that caught and held her attention. They were a deep brown, warm and steady, and they looked at her with a concern that seemed genuine. "Thank you," Josephine said, her voice stronger now though still shaky. "I thought I was going to die out there." "The storm came up fast," Zachary said, standing to fetch a tin cup. He filled it with water from a pitcher and brought it to her. "Drink slowly. Not too much at once." Josephine accepted the cup with trembling hands, grateful when Zachary kept his own hands wrapped around hers to steady it. The water was cool and clean, tasting faintly of minerals, and she had never experienced anything so wonderful. She took 3 small sips, then handed the cup back. "I left Belmont this afternoon," she explained, feeling like she owed this man some explanation for appearing on his doorstep half dead. "I was trying to reach the mining camp to the east. I heard they needed a cook." Zachary's eyebrows rose. "You were walking." "That is a good 15 miles, and the terrain between here and there is rough even in good weather. I did not have many options." Josephine's voice carried a bitter edge. "And I did not exactly leave with time to make proper travel arrangements." There was a story there, Zachary knew, but he did not press. Instead, he moved to the small stove in the corner of the cabin where a pot of stew had been simmering. He ladled a generous portion into a bowl and brought it to her along with a spoon. "You need to eat. Get your strength back." The smell of the stew made Josephine's stomach clench with sudden hunger. She could not remember the last time she had eaten, had been too nervous about her escape plan to force down breakfast that morning. She accepted the bowl and took a cautious bite. Rabbit, potatoes, carrots, and herbs. Simple but delicious. She ate slowly, savoring each spoonful while Zachary moved about the cabin giving her space. The cabin itself was small but well maintained. A single room with a sleeping area in one corner, a small kitchen area with the stove and a table, and a sitting area near the fireplace. The floor was wood plank, swept clean, and the walls were solid timber chinked with mud. Rifles hung on pegs near the door along with various tools and tack. A pair of saddlebags sat in the corner, and through the single window, Josephine could see a small barn about 20 yards from the cabin. "You live here alone?" she asked between bites. Zachary glanced at her from where he was stoking the fire. "Most of the time. I have a small ranch, about 200 acres. Run cattle and a few horses. It is not much, but it is mine." There was pride in his voice, and Josephine understood that. In this hard land, owning anything of value was an accomplishment. "How long have you been here?" 3 years. "Bought the land with money I saved working cattle drives and doing ranch work for other people. Built this cabin myself the first year." He straightened, dusting his hands on his pants. "What about you? Where are you from originally?" "Ohio," Josephine said softly. "Cleveland." "My father was a shopkeeper. After he died, my mother and I came west with my uncle. That was 4 years ago. Mama died of fever our first winter in California, and my uncle brought me to Nevada when he heard about the mining opportunities." She paused, her hands tightening on the bowl. "He died in a mine collapse 2 years ago. Left debts. Marcus bought those debts and decided that meant he owned me too." Zachary's jaw tightened. He had heard similar stories before, seen how men like this Marcus character preyed on vulnerable women. "You do not owe him anything." "Debts do not transfer like that, not legally." "Maybe not legally," Josephine said bitterly. "But legality does not mean much when the man owns the sheriff and half the town council. No one was going to help me, so you ran." "So I ran." She finished the stew and set the bowl aside, pulling the blankets tighter around herself. The shivering had mostly stopped, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. He will be angry. Marcus does not like losing things he considers his property. Zachary crossed his arms, his expression hard. "He can be as angry as he wants. He has no claim on you, and he sure as hell is not getting within 100 yards of this cabin." Josephine wanted to argue, to warn him that Marcus was dangerous, that he had a reputation for violence when crossed, but the words would not come. She was too tired, too worn down by fear and cold and the sheer effort of survival. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she found herself struggling to keep them open. "You need rest," Zachary said, noticing her exhaustion. "Take the bed, I will sleep by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," Josephine protested weakly. "You can and you will." His tone left no room for argument. He helped her stand, keeping the blankets wrapped around her, and guided her to the bed in the corner. It was a simple frame with a rope lattice supporting a thick mattress stuffed with straw and topped with more wool blankets. To Josephine, it looked like the finest hotel bed in San Francisco. She sank onto the mattress with a sigh of relief, and Zachary pulled the blankets up around her. "Sleep," he said gently. "We can figure out everything else tomorrow." Josephine wanted to thank him again, wanted to ask why he was being so kind to a stranger, but sleep claimed her before she could form the words. She dropped into unconsciousness like a stone into a well, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion that had been clawing at her for hours. Zachary stood watching her for a moment, this woman who had literally collapsed on his doorstep during a hailstorm. Her face, cleaned of blood and with color slowly returning to her cheeks, was striking. High cheekbones, a straight nose, and lips that even in sleep held a hint of determination. Her dark hair was beginning to dry, spreading across his pillow in waves. He turned away, giving her privacy, and moved to hang her wet clothes near the fire to dry. The dress was poor quality, much mended, and the undergarments were little better. This was not a woman who had been living well, despite being the companion of a saloon owner. That told Zachary more than words could have about the nature of her relationship with this Marcus. The storm continued to rage outside, hail hammering against the roof and walls, wind howling like a living thing. Zachary was grateful he had brought the horses into the barn earlier when he had noticed the strange color of the western sky. They would be safe, and he had plenty of supplies to wait out the storm however long it lasted. He settled into his chair by the fire, his rifle across his lap more out of habit than any real concern. His mind turned over the situation, considering the implications of harboring a woman who was clearly running from someone powerful in Belmont. Zachary had no love for men who abused their power, who thought money gave them the right to own people, but he was also pragmatic enough to know that standing up to such men could be dangerous. Still, there had never really been a choice. He could no more have turned Josephine away than he could have stopped breathing. It was not in his nature to abandon someone in need, and beyond that, something about the woman sleeping in his bed called to him in a way he could not quite name. Perhaps it was the courage it must have taken to run, or the vulnerability mixed with fierce determination he had seen in her green eyes. Whatever it was, Zachary knew his life had just become considerably more complicated. The night passed slowly. The storm gradually diminished, the hail giving way to rain and then finally to a cold drizzle. Zachary dozed in his chair, waking periodically to add wood to the fire and check on his unexpected guest. Each time, he found Josephine sleeping deeply, her breathing even and her color much improved. Dawn arrived gray and overcast, the sun hidden behind layers of clouds. Zachary rose stiffly from his chair, stretching out the kinks in his back, and went about his morning routine as quietly as possible. He added wood to the fire, then slipped outside to check on the animals. The landscape was littered with hailstones, some as large as his fist, and puddles of water stood everywhere. His small garden plot was destroyed, the young plants beaten into the mud, and part of the barn roof had sustained damage where the wind had torn away several shingles. Could have been worse, he thought. Much worse. The horses whickered in greeting when he entered the barn, and he took his time feeding them and the 3 milk cows he kept. The chickens had survived unscathed in their sheltered coop, and he collected eggs, thinking about breakfast. His mind kept drifting back to the woman in his cabin, wondering what she would decide to do when she woke. Would she want to continue on to the mining camp, or would she need more time to recover? And what would he do if this Marcus came looking for her? When Zachary returned to the cabin, arms full of eggs and a pail of fresh milk, he found Josephine awake and sitting up in bed, the blankets pulled up to her chin. Her eyes were clear, and she looked much better than she had the night before, though he could see the fear and uncertainty written plainly across her face. "Good morning," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "How are you feeling?" "Sore," Josephine admitted, "and embarrassed." "I am wearing nothing but your blankets." Zachary felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he kept his expression neutral. "Your dress is dry. I can step outside while you put it on." "Thank you." Josephine's voice was soft, grateful. She waited until he had set down the eggs and milk, and retreated outside before she slipped from the bed and hurried to where her dress hung near the fire. It was still slightly damp but wearable, and she dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. The fabric was stiff with dried sweat and rain, and there were new tears in several places, but it was better than nothing. When she opened the door to signal he could return, Zachary noted how the morning light caught in her dark hair and made her green eyes seem to glow. Even in her worn, damaged dress, even with the bruise forming on her temple where the hail had struck her, she was beautiful. The thought surprised him with its intensity. "Sit by the fire," he said, busying himself with breakfast preparations to cover his reaction. "I will make us something to eat, and then we can talk about what comes next." Josephine did as instructed, watching as Zachary moved around the small kitchen area with practiced ease. He cracked eggs into a pan, sliced bread from a loaf, and poured milk into tin cups. The domesticity of the scene was almost surreal after the terror of the previous day. "You are a good cook," she observed as he handed her a plate of eggs and bread. "A man living alone learns to cook, or he starves," Zachary said with a slight smile. "It is not fancy, but it keeps me alive." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Zachary spoke again. "You said you were heading to the mining camp. Do you have family there? Friends?" Josephine shook her head. "No one. I just heard they needed workers. I thought I could find something, maybe work in the kitchen or take in laundry, anything honest." "That camp is rough," Zachary said carefully. "Mostly men, hard men doing hard work. It is not the safest place for a woman alone." "Safer than Belmont," Josephine countered. "Safer than staying with Marcus." Zachary could not argue with that logic. He set down his fork and looked at her directly. "What if you stayed here?" Josephine's eyes widened. "What? Stay here?" Zachary repeated. "I could use help around the ranch. The garden needs replanting after the storm. The chickens and cows need tending, and I am a terrible cook despite what I said earlier. You could work for room and board, wages when I can afford them. It would be honest work and you would be safe." "You do not know me," Josephine said, her heart pounding. "I could be a thief, a liar." "Could be," Zachary agreed, "but I do not think you are. I think you are a woman who has had a rough time and deserves a chance to build something better." He paused. "And I think you know you are not ready to face the mining camp yet. You need time to recover, to rest. Stay here. Give it a month. If after that you want to move on, I will take you wherever you want to go myself. No obligations." Josephine stared at him, searching his face for any sign of ulterior motives. She had learned the hard way that men rarely offered something for nothing, that kindness usually came with strings attached. But Zachary's brown eyes were steady and honest, and she found herself wanting desperately to believe him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Zachary was silent for a moment, considering his answer. "My mother was in a situation like yours once," he said finally. "Before she met my father, she had been married to a man who beat her, who treated her like property. She ran, just like you did. A kind family took her in, gave her a safe place to land until she could figure out her next step. She never forgot that kindness, and she raised me to pay it forward when I could." He met Josephine's gaze. "I am paying it forward." Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes, the first she had allowed herself to cry in months. She blinked them back, not wanting to seem weak, but one escaped anyway, trailing down her cheek. "1 month," she said. "I will stay for 1 month." 1 month, Zachary agreed, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him. "And Josephine, you do not have to thank me. Just help me fix that garden and we will call it even." A small smile tugged at Josephine's lips. the first genuine smile she had managed in longer than she could remember. "I can do that." Over the following days, they fell into a routine. Josephine proved herself capable and hardworking, rising with the dawn to tend the chickens and gather eggs while Zachary saw to the horses and cattle. They worked together to replant the garden, their hands side by side in the dark earth, and Josephine discovered that she enjoyed the simple act of nurturing growing things. She took over the cooking, and Zachary was grateful to eat meals that consisted of more than just burned meat and undercooked beans. They talked while they worked, sharing pieces of their pasts in careful increments. Zachary told her about growing up in Wyoming, about his parents who had died of influenza when he was 25, about the years he had spent drifting before deciding to put down roots in Nevada. Josephine spoke about her childhood in Ohio, about her father's shop and the books he had let her read when business was slow, about the dreams she had once harbored of becoming a teacher before circumstances had stolen those dreams away. What Josephine did not speak about, and what Zachary did not press her on, were the details of her time with Marcus. He could see the shadows that crossed her face sometimes when she thought he was not looking, could see the way she flinched at sudden movements or loud noises. Whatever had happened to her in Belmont had left scars that went deeper than skin, and Zachary found himself hoping that time and safety might allow those scars to heal. A week passed, then two. The weather turned properly warm, spring asserting itself with wildflowers blooming across the Nevada landscape, and the garden beginning to show the first green shoots of new growth. Josephine's bruises faded, and color returned to her cheeks. She smiled more readily, laughed at Zachary's dry observations about the contrary nature of cows, and began to seem less like a frightened refugee and more like a woman coming into her own. Zachary, for his part, found himself increasingly aware of Josephine's presence in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude or charity. He noticed the way she hummed while she worked, the grace of her movements as she went about her tasks, the intelligence that shone in her green eyes when they discussed books or current events. He caught himself watching her more often than was strictly proper, and he lay awake at night listening to the soft sound of her breathing from the bed he had insisted she continue to use. He was falling for her. The realization came to him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the Nevada hills, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. Josephine was telling him a story about a mischievous trick she had played on her uncle when she was 12, her face animated and her laughter ringing out clear and bright, and Zachary felt his heart turn over in his chest. He loved her. Loved her courage and her strength, her kindness to the animals and the way she had begun to treat his cabin like a home. Loved the woman she was becoming now that she was free from fear. The realization terrified him. He had no right to feel this way about a woman who was only staying with him temporarily, who had made no indication that she saw him as anything other than a benefactor. And even if she did share his feelings, what could he offer her? A small ranch that barely turned a profit, a rough cabin in the middle of nowhere, a life of hard work and simple pleasures. What if she wanted more? What if, once she had recovered fully from her ordeal, she decided to move on to Sacramento or San Francisco, to find the life that had been stolen from her? Josephine noticed his silence and turned to him with a questioning look. "Are you all right? You look troubled." "Just thinking," Zachary said, forcing a smile. "Nothing important." But it was important, the most important thing that had ever happened to him, and as the days continued to pass, Zachary found it increasingly difficult to hide his feelings. He became more careful about casual touches, about letting his hand linger when he passed her something, about standing too close while they worked. He did not want to make her uncomfortable, did not want to be just another man trying to claim ownership of her choices. Josephine, meanwhile, was fighting her own internal battle. She had not expected to feel safe with Zachary, had not expected to trust him as completely as she found herself doing. And she certainly had not expected to develop feelings for him that went far beyond gratitude. But somewhere between the shared meals and the companionable silences, somewhere between his patient teaching her how to milk a cow and her mending the tears in his shirts, she had fallen in love with Zachary Ashford. It was different from anything she had ever felt before. With Marcus, there had only been fear and revulsion, a desperate desire to escape. But with Zachary, she felt something warm and steady, something that grew stronger with each passing day. She loved the way he treated the animals with firm kindness, the way he spoke to her as an equal, the way he had never once made her feel like she owed him anything beyond honest work. She loved his quiet strength, his dry humor, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. But she was afraid to say anything. What if he did not feel the same way? What if his kindness was just kindness, nothing more? What if she ruined the safe haven she had found by admitting feelings that were not reciprocated? So she kept silent, hoarding her feelings like precious secrets, and tried to pretend that her heart did not race every time their eyes met across the dinner table. The month marker came and went without discussion. Neither of them mentioned it, both silently agreeing to let the arrangement continue without formally addressing the changed timeline. Josephine had nowhere else she wanted to be, and Zachary could not imagine his cabin without her presence filling it. But the peace they had built was fragile, and both of them knew it. Belmont was only 5 miles away, close enough that the threat of Marcus discovering Josephine's location hung over them like a storm cloud on the horizon. That storm broke on a hot afternoon in late May. Zachary had ridden into the small town of Winston, about 10 miles south of his ranch, to purchase supplies and sell a cow. He had asked Josephine if she wanted to come, but she had declined, preferring to stay at the cabin where she felt safe. He had been reluctant to leave her alone, but had eventually agreed when she pointed out that no one knew she was there, and she would keep the rifle close. Josephine was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her blood turned to ice, and she dropped the weeds she had been holding, running for the cabin and the rifle that leaned just inside the door. Her hands were shaking as she grabbed it, checking to make sure it was loaded the way Zachary had taught her. She moved to the window, peering out carefully, and her worst fears were confirmed. 3 men on horseback were approaching the cabin, and even at a distance, she recognized the lead rider. Marcus Hendricks sat his horse like a king surveying his domain, his expensive suit and polished boots at odds with the rough Nevada landscape. He was a large man, running to fat but still powerful, with a florid face and cold eyes. The 2 men flanking him were his usual hired muscle, both of them hard-eyed and armed. Josephine's first instinct was to run, to flee out the back and try to hide in the barn or the surrounding countryside. But something made her stand her ground. This was Zachary's home, her home now too, and she was done running. She positioned herself behind the heavy table, using it as a barricade, and aimed the rifle at the door. Marcus dismounted and walked to the door with the confidence of a man who expected no resistance. He knocked 3 sharp raps and called out, "Josephine, I know you are in there. Come out now and we can talk about this like reasonable people." Josephine's finger tensed on the trigger, but she forced herself to take a breath before responding. "Go away, Marcus. I do not belong to you. I do not owe you anything." There was a pause, and then Marcus's voice came again, harder this time. "You embarrassed me, girl, made me look like a fool in front of the whole town. You think you can just walk away from your obligations. I have no obligations to you, Josephine shouted back. My uncle's debts died with him. You have no legal claim on me. Marcus laughed, the sound devoid of humor. Legal claim? Sweetheart, I own the law in Belmont. What I say goes. Now stop this foolishness and come out. I promise I will go easy on you. The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Josephine felt fear claw at her throat. But beneath the fear was anger, hot and righteous. She had spent 6 months living in terror of this man, and she was not going back to that life. Not now, not ever. If you try to come through that door, I will shoot you, she said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. I mean it, Marcus. Leave now. There was another pause, longer this time, and Josephine could hear the murmur of voices as Marcus conferred with his men. Then came the sound of boots on the porch, and Josephine knew he was going to call her bluff. The door burst open, Marcus's shoulder hitting it with enough force to tear it halfway off its hinges. Josephine did not hesitate. She pulled the trigger, and the rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The bullet struck the door frame inches from Marcus's head, sending splinters flying. He jumped back with a curse, and his 2 men drew their own guns. You little witch, Marcus roared. I am going to make you regret that. Josephine was frantically trying to reload, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the ammunition, when she heard the sound that would replay in her nightmares for years to come. The thunder of a horse at full gallop, and then Zachary's voice, hard as iron and cold as winter. Step away from my house. Josephine looked up to see Zachary sitting his horse about 20 yards away, his rifle already aimed at Marcus. His face was set in lines of fury, and his eyes were flat and dangerous. This was not the gentle man who had rescued her from the storm or who laughed at her stories over dinner. This was a man who had lived through violence and knew exactly how to dispense it when necessary. Marcus turned, his surprise evident. This is none of your business, friend. I am just collecting what is mine. She is not yours, Zachary said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. And this is very much my business, since you are trespassing on my land and threatening a woman under my protection. Your protection, Marcus sneered. What are you, her knight in shining armor? She is a saloon girl, a nobody, worth nothing. Zachary's finger tightened on the trigger, and for a moment Josephine thought he was going to shoot Marcus where he stood, but his voice remained level when he spoke. You have 3 seconds to get on your horses and leave. After that, I start shooting, and I will not be aiming for door frames. The 2 hired men exchanged nervous glances. They were bullies, used to intimidating unarmed women and drunks, not facing down a man who clearly knew how to use the rifle he was holding. Marcus saw their hesitation and knew he had lost this round. This is not over, he said, his face purple with rage. You are making a big mistake, friend. I have influence in this territory. I can make your life very difficult. And I have friends who are federal marshals, Zachary lied smoothly. Push me, and I will have them looking into your business affairs. I imagine they would find all sorts of interesting violations. Fraud, maybe. Extortion. How many other women have you coerced into working for you by claiming they owed you debts? Marcus's eyes narrowed, and Josephine could see the calculation happening behind them. He was weighing his options, trying to decide if pursuing this was worth the potential risk. Finally, he turned and stalked back to his horse, his men following quickly. You have not heard the last of this, Marcus called as he mounted. That girl belongs in Belmont, and sooner or later she will come back. They always do. Zachary did not lower his rifle until all 3 men had ridden out of sight. Even then, he kept it at the ready as he dismounted and approached the cabin. Josephine met him at the door, and the moment she saw his face up close, saw the concern beneath the anger, Her composure broke. She collapsed against him, sobs racking her body, and Zachary wrapped his free arm around her, holding her tight while she cried out months of fear and tension. "You are safe," he murmured into her hair. "I have got you. You are safe." It took a long time for the tears to subside. When they finally did, Josephine pulled back, wiping at her face with shaking hands. "I am sorry," she said. "I nearly got you killed." "You did nothing wrong," Zachary said firmly. He set his rifle aside and cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Do you hear me, Josephine? This was not your fault. That man has no right to you, and if he comes back, he will regret it. But what if he does what he threatened? What if he makes trouble for you? Let him try." Zachary's expression was fierce. "I am not afraid of men like Marcus Hendricks. Bullies fold when someone stands up to them." Josephine searched his face, seeing the determination there, the protectiveness that ran bone deep. "Why are you doing this? Why are you risking so much for me?" The question hung between them, and Zachary knew he had reached a crossroads. He could give her another platitude about paying forward kindness, or he could tell her the truth that had been burning in his chest for weeks. He chose truth. "Because I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you since about a week after you arrived, and I cannot stand by and watch anyone hurt you. I know I have no right to feel this way, and I know you might not feel the same, but there it is. I love you, Josephine Parker." Josephine's breath caught. Of all the things she had expected him to say, this was the last. But as the words registered, as she saw the vulnerability in his brown eyes, she felt something break open inside her chest, something warm and bright and terrifying. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have for a while now, but I was afraid to say it, afraid you would not want me that way." Zachary let out a breath he had not known he was holding. "Want you? Josephine, I want you more than I have ever wanted anything. I want you to stay here, not as a worker but as my wife, if you will have me. I know this is sudden, and I know I do not have much to offer, but I swear to you I will spend the rest of my life making you happy if you will let me." Tears were streaming down Josephine's face again, but these were different tears, born of joy rather than fear. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Zachary pulled her close and kissed her, and it was like nothing either of them had ever experienced before. It was gentle and fierce all at once, tender and passionate, a promise and a claiming. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless. "We should do it soon," Zachary said. "Get married in Winston, make it official. That way, if Marcus tries anything else, he will be threatening a married woman, and that is a whole different kind of crime." Josephine nodded, practical even in the midst of her happiness. "When?" "Tomorrow," Zachary said. "We can ride to Winston first thing, find the preacher, and be married by noon." "Tomorrow," Josephine agreed, and the smile that lit up her face was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. They spent the rest of the day repairing the door and talking about their future. Zachary told her about his plans to expand the ranch, to buy more cattle and maybe build a larger house in a few years. Josephine told him about her dream of starting a school in the area, teaching the scattered ranch children who had no access to education. They spoke of children of their own, of the life they would build together, and for the first time in years, Josephine allowed herself to hope. That night, Josephine slept in the bed while Zachary took his usual place by the fire, both of them too conscious of propriety to share sleeping space before they were wed. But tomorrow, Zachary thought as he drifted off to sleep, tomorrow she would be his wife in truth, and they would face whatever came together. True to their word, they rose at dawn and made the journey to Winston. Josephine wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton thing she had made from fabric Zachary had bought on his last supply run, and Zachary wore his cleanest shirt, and his only suit jacket. They were both nervous as they approached the small white church at the edge of town, but the minister who greeted them was kind and asked no awkward questions about their haste. The ceremony was simple, just the two of them and the minister's wife as witness, but it was perfect. Zachary's voice was steady as he spoke his vows, promising to love and cherish Josephine for the rest of his days. And Josephine's voice was clear and strong as she made the same promises in return. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary kissed her with a tenderness that made the minister's wife sigh romantically. They returned to the ranch as Mr. and Mrs. Zachary Ashford, and if the enormity of what they had done felt overwhelming, neither of them showed it. That night, as Zachary finally joined Josephine in the bed that was now theirs to share as they came together as husband and wife for the first time, Josephine felt the last of her old fears fall away. She was safe. She was loved. She was home. The weeks that followed were a kind of honeymoon, though neither of them could afford to take time away from the work that needed doing. They labored side by side under the hot Nevada sun, planting and tending and building. The ranch began to thrive under their combined efforts. The garden produced abundantly, the chickens laid more eggs than two people could eat, and the cattle fattened on summer grass. Zachary taught Josephine to ride properly, and she turned out to be a natural horsewoman. She taught him to read beyond the basic level he had achieved, sharing books she borrowed from the few neighbors who had them. They made love under the stars on warm nights, explored each other's bodies and hearts with equal fascination, and built the foundation of a marriage that would withstand whatever trials lay ahead. And trials did come. Marcus made good on his threat to cause trouble, spreading rumors about Zachary and Josephine in Belmont, and trying to turn other ranchers against them. But Zachary's reputation for honesty and hard work preceded him, and most people ignored the bitter complaints of a man who was known to be vindictive. In August, one of Marcus's hired men showed up at the ranch with an offer. Marcus would drop all claims to Josephine and stop causing trouble if Zachary paid him $500. Zachary's response was to escort the man off his property at gunpoint and send a message back to Marcus that if he or any of his people set foot on the ranch again, Zachary would shoot first and ask questions later. After that, Marcus seemed to accept defeat. The rumors stopped, and though Josephine still felt a shiver of fear whenever she had to go into Belmont for supplies, which was rare, Marcus never approached her. He had moved on to easier prey, and Josephine said a prayer for whoever that poor woman might be. Autumn brought cooler temperatures and the hard work of preparing for winter. They harvested the garden, preserved vegetables and fruit, and butchered a steer for meat. Josephine proved herself skilled at smoking meat and making preserves, and their small root cellar filled with provisions that would see them through the cold months. It was in late September that Josephine began to suspect she might be pregnant. Her monthly courses were late, and she found herself feeling nauseous in the mornings. She said nothing to Zachary at first, afraid to hope, but when another week passed with no sign of her courses, she finally told him. Zachary's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His face lit up with pure joy, and he swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop before she was sick. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby." They spent the evening making plans, discussing names and whether the baby would be a boy or a girl. Zachary wanted to add a room to the cabin, a proper nursery, and Josephine started knitting tiny clothes and blankets. The pregnancy was relatively easy, and Josephine continued to work alongside Zachary for most of it, only slowing down in the final months when her belly grew too large to allow easy movement. Winter came, cold but manageable, and they spent the long dark evenings by the fire, Zachary's hand resting on Josephine's belly to feel the baby kick. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing dreams and fears, learning new facets of each other with each passing day. Their love deepened, becoming something solid and unshakable, a bedrock upon which to build their lives. Spring arrived just as Josephine's time drew near, and on a warm April afternoon, almost exactly a year after the hailstorm that had brought them together, Josephine went into labor. Zachary rode like hell to fetch the midwife from Winston, a competent woman named Mrs. Sullivan, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Zachary, waiting anxiously outside the cabin, thought he might lose his mind with worry. But Josephine was strong, stronger than he had known, and when the sun rose on a new day, their son came into the world with a loud cry that announced his arrival to anyone within earshot. Zachary was allowed in to meet his son, and the sight of Josephine holding their baby, her face exhausted but radiant, made his eyes sting with tears. "He is perfect," he said, kneeling beside the bed and touching one tiny hand with a finger. The baby grasped it with surprising strength, and Zachary felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "What should we name him?" Josephine asked softly. They had discussed names endlessly, but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at his son's red face and shock of dark hair, Zachary knew. "Thomas," he said, "after your father." Josephine's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas Ashford," she whispered. "It is perfect." Thomas proved to be a healthy, happy baby who slept reasonably well and nursed eagerly. Josephine recovered quickly from the birth, and within weeks, she was back to her usual routine, though now with a baby strapped to her back or napping in a basket she kept near wherever she was working. Life settled into a new rhythm. The ranch continued to grow, and Zachary was able to hire a young man from Winston to help with some of the heavier work, freeing up time for him to spend with his family. Josephine started her school just as she had dreamed, teaching a handful of children from neighboring ranches in the mornings while Thomas napped. She was a natural teacher, patient and creative, and the children flourished under her guidance. 2 years passed, then 3. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious toddler who followed his father everywhere and adored his mother with single-minded devotion. Josephine became pregnant again, and this time she delivered a daughter they named Clara, after Zachary's mother. Clara had her father's brown eyes and her mother's dark hair, and from the moment she entered the world, she owned both her parents completely. The ranch prospered beyond their early dreams. Zachary was able to build the larger house he had promised, a proper 2-story structure with a real kitchen and separate bedrooms for the children. They kept the original cabin as a guest house and storage, but the new house felt like a symbol of everything they had built together. Marcus Hendricks died in 1877 of a heart attack, and when Josephine heard the news, she felt only a distant sense of relief. That part of her life felt like it belonged to a different person, someone she had once been but was no longer. She was Josephine Ashford now, wife and mother, teacher and rancher, a woman who had built a good life from the ashes of a bad one. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Zachary gave Josephine a gift that made her cry. It was a book, leather-bound and expensive, filled with blank pages. "For your stories," he said. "You are always telling the children such wonderful tales. I thought you might like to write them down." Josephine did write them down, filling page after page with stories of courage and kindness, of people who overcame adversity and found happiness. She never wrote about her own escape from Belmont, feeling that some stories were too personal to share, but elements of it crept into her tales. Strong women who did not give up, kind men who helped without expecting repayment, and always, always, the triumph of love over fear. Thomas and Clara grew, joined eventually by a third child, a boy they named Samuel, who was born when Josephine was 34. By then, the ranch was one of the most successful in the region, and Josephine's school had expanded to include more than 20 children. They had friends, respect, and a place in the community that felt earned and solid. There were hard times, of course. A drought one year that killed half their cattle. An illness that swept through the area and took several neighbors. The death of Zachary's favorite horse. But they weathered each storm together, their love a constant that held them steady through whatever difficulties arose. Josephine never forgot the hailstorm that had brought her to Zachary's door, never forgot the feel of ice pelting her skin, or the terror of thinking she might die alone in the Nevada wilderness. But she also never forgot the sight of Zachary's face when he opened that door, the absolute safety she had felt in his arms, or the way he had looked at her with such gentle concern. That moment had been the beginning of everything good in her life. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Josephine and Zachary would sit on the porch of their house and watch the sun set over the land they had built together. Sometimes they talked, sharing thoughts and observations. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, his hand in hers, content with each other's presence. "You ever regret it?" Zachary asked one evening, the question coming out of nowhere. "Running that day, coming here?" Josephine turned to look at him, seeing the gray that was beginning to thread through his dark hair, the lines that years of sun and hard work had etched into his face. He was older now, as was she, but he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. More importantly, he was still the kindest, the most steadfast, the one who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "That hailstorm brought me to you, it brought me home." Zachary smiled and leaned over to kiss her, the same gentle, loving kiss he had given her 1,000 times before and would give her 1,000 times more. "I love you," he said. "I love you too," Josephine replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Years continued to pass. Thomas grew into a fine young man who eventually married a girl from Winston and started his own ranch nearby. Clara became a teacher like her mother, opening a school in a growing town to the east. Samuel, the baby, showed signs of becoming a skilled horse trainer and spent his days working with the animals he loved. Josephine and Zachary grew old together, their bodies wearing down from years of hard work, but their love as strong as ever. They became grandparents, delighting in the children their own children brought into the world. The ranch passed to Thomas eventually, though Zachary remained active in its management until his health simply would not allow it anymore. On a spring morning in 1893, almost exactly 40 years after the hailstorm that had changed everything, Josephine sat beside Zachary's bed, holding his hand as he took his last breaths. He was 74 years old and she was 65, and they had been given more years together than either had dared to hope for. "Remember the hailstorm," Zachary whispered, his voice thin with age and illness. "Every day," Josephine said, tears streaming down her face. "I remember every moment with you. Best day of my life," Zachary said. "The day you walked through that door." "You saved me," Josephine said. "No," Zachary's eyes, still that warm brown she had fallen in love with so long ago, looked at her with perfect clarity. "We saved each other." He died with her hand in his, a slight smile on his face, and Josephine knew that even in her grief, she had been blessed beyond measure. They had built something beautiful together, a life full of love and meaning, and no amount of time could ever diminish what they had shared. Josephine lived for another 6 years after Zachary's passing, staying active with her grandchildren and her writing. She filled 3 more books with stories, all of which were treasured by her family and shared throughout the community. When she finally followed Zachary in 1899, passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 71, she was laid to rest beside him on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built. Their children and grandchildren continued the legacy they had started, the ranch staying in the family through generations. And always, the story was told of how it all began. Of a young woman who walked through a hailstorm to reach safety, and a cowboy who opened his door just in time. Of 2 people who found each other when they needed it most and built a love that lasted a lifetime. The small gravestone on the hill carried both their names and a simple inscription chosen by their children. Together they weathered every storm. It was a fitting epitaph for a love story that had begun in ice and wind and had ended in peace and completion. Josephine Parker had walked through a hailstorm and found more than just safety. She had found home, love, and a life beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. And Zachary Ashford, who had opened his door on that violent spring evening, had found the missing piece of himself that he had not even known he was seeking. Their story became part of the fabric of Nevada history, told and retold by their descendants, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us directly to the best, that courage and kindness can transform everything. That love, real and true love, is worth every risk and every hardship. The ranch still stands today, now operated by great-great-grandchildren who never knew Josephine and Zachary personally, but who feel their presence in every corner of the land. The original cabin is preserved as a historical site, and visitors can still see the door frame where Josephine's desperate shot left a scar in the wood. They can stand on the spot where Zachary proposed, where babies were born, where an entire family tree took root. But more than the physical legacy, what Josephine and Zachary left behind was proof that even in the hardest of times, even in a land as unforgiving as the Old West, love could not only survive but thrive. Their story was not one of perfection or ease. It was a story of 2 flawed, frightened people who chose each other every single day, who worked hard and loved harder, who built something lasting from nothing more than determination and hope. When the hail had fallen that April evening in 1853, when ice had hammered the earth and wind had screamed its fury, neither Josephine nor Zachary could have known what was beginning. They could not have seen the decades of happiness ahead, the children and grandchildren, the quiet evenings and the shared laughter. All they knew was the moment, the desperate need and the answering compassion, the opening of a door at exactly the right time. But that single moment, that intersection of need and kindness, had been enough. From that frozen beginning had grown something warm and enduring, a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of human connection. And if, on certain spring evenings when the weather turns volatile and hail threatens the Nevada landscape, the descendants of Josephine and Zachary Ashford look out from the porch of the ranch house and think they can almost see 2 figures there, a woman in a worn dress running toward shelter and a tall man opening a door, well, perhaps that is not so strange. Some stories are too powerful to fade completely. Some loves are too strong to be contained by something as simple as death. The hailstorm that brought them together was long over, but its echoes remained, a reminder that sometimes the storms we face are not obstacles but pathways, leading us exactly where we need to be. Josephine had walked through ice and wind to reach safety, and what she had found on the other side was so much more. She had found her future, her partner, her home. She had found Zachary and he had found her, and together they had created something that would outlast them both. In the end, that is what matters. Not the hardships or the struggles, not the fear or the pain, but what we build with the time we are given. Josephine and Zachary had built something beautiful, something that lasted long after the hail had melted and the storms had passed. They had built a love that spanned decades, a family that would continue for generations, and a story that would never be forgotten. The cowboy had opened his door just in time, and the woman who walked through the hailstorm had finally, truly come home.